The route is being calculated.
Does the world come to you?
At a 46, 3000.
Below the threshold of consciousness.
Take for takeoff at
Abstract intellect.
L'itinerario comprende strade con pedaggi.
The frequency may vary.
The route is being calculated.
This is human, I think.
The route calculation is complete. Please proceed to the nearest road.
Now in the back of the milk, they're black.
Please hang up and try your call again. Please hang up. This is a recording. We're sorry, the number played is not.
Actually, back on a runaway train, you know.
Turn right after 100 meters.
Hello, Bill?
The route
This is a recording.
turns left.
Bill, are you there?
Hello, I'm here in the back seat.
I think a question on a lot of people's minds right now is simply what the hell is going on?
We're sorry, the
We're sort of on some kind of cusp of change that I assume is technologically driven. It's not legislated change.
last turn.
Turn right.
What will become of us? You and me.
It's just happening. We're in something. We're in something here, and it's out of control.
Bill, are you there?
Hello?
How might humans become post-human?
It's technology-based, and it's assumed to be the result of the advent of functional nanotechnology or of some sort of synergism in these various all these different emerging technologies we have. So if somehow there could be a synergism between computation and genetic research.
What might that mean?
Well, immortality, the end of economics. Functional nanotech would pretty much guarantee both of those, because there would be, no reason to die if you had sufficient nanotech to keep resetting little cellular clocks. And with even sort of half-assed nanotech, you can make anything out of anything. So you can make gold bars out of McDonald's burgers or McDonald's burgers out of garbage. But there's no basis for this whole thing that we've always done about value. Anyone could have anything they wanted at any time. And it would everything, including human beings, would be completely protean. It could look and act like anything at all. It's a compelling vision, but it's just not one that I'm able to get my head around. There's no traction for me there. It's the point where I really do belong to the old order. Well, I think what I'm most aware of is the extent to which people are unaware of the extent to which they've been interpenetrated and co-opted by their technology. I mean, I take it for granted that I've been, but I don't think most. I think most people. I think a lot of people today have this sort of Rousseau-esque idea that it's possible for humans to return to the natural state, but in fact, I think it's not. And if it were, they really wouldn't like it. I mean, I'm immune to a number of really terrible diseases because I was inoculated against them as a child. That's technology. I'm a male human in my 50s and I still have most of my teeth. That's technology. I'm myopic to the point of near blindness, and yet I can see. And that's technology. It's too close to us to be very aware of it. If we could be stripped of it, which we can't be because it's actually altered our physical being, we'd be pretty unhappy, you know? And we'd start dying big time. It's a strange thing. It may be a byproduct of what I do for a living, but I probably worry less about the real future than the average person. We've gotten to the point where in some ways it's not knowable. When I was a kid, we were told that it was. That was when, you know, when the future with a capital F was very much a going concern in North America. That was part of our culture in the 50s, that the future was coming and it was going to be planned. It was going to happen because grown-ups were making decisions. My childhood sort of was split down the middle by the Cold War, so there was one future that was very much the future of the Willie Lee rockets, missiles, and space travel books. And the other future was a sort of atomic wasteland. I mean, it's very easy. It's amazingly easy for me to forget that I lived most of my life accepting that the world could quite literally and horribly end any moment.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The only memory I have of a world prior to media is of standing in a peanut field on a farm in Tennessee, looking down the hill at a black 1950s, sort of late 40s panel truck driving along a road. One of the next earliest memories is of my father bringing home this wooden box-like thing with a cloth grill on the front and a little round circular television screen, which I believe we had for some time prior to there actually being any broadcast to receive. And then there was a test pattern. I think the test pattern preceded any actual broadcast for several weeks, and the test pattern itself was only available briefly at scheduled times. And neighbors would come and they would look at this static, non-moving pattern on this screen that promised something. And then television came.
And again, it hammered.
It's funny, I walked out of the Matrix last night and went to an ATM and got some money out of my checking account in Vancouver without even using a credit card, just using a bank courtesy card. And the ATM in Santa Monica told me exactly how much money was remaining in my account in Vancouver. And just for a minute, it struck me as miraculous. and kind of spooky. I had that feeling of, that post-geographical feeling. I think we've been growing a sort of prosthetic, extended nervous system for the last 100 years or so. And it's really starting to take, it's really starting to grow now. We're dealing with something that has penetrated virtually every corner of the human universe now. It's increasingly difficult to find people who have not been affected by media. It's very difficult to find non-mediated human beings, whereas in the 1920s you could go back in the Appalachians and record musicians who had never heard recorded music. And I think that music, those early recordings, sound fundamentally different. It's something very different was going on then, and something changed.
I know our girl who is all alone. Her man treating her mean. Told me she's
I remember once I was very struck by finding a diary entry somewhere that where a man had heard a Victrola for the first time. He'd heard an English clergyman had gone to a garden party and he'd heard an Edison wax cylinder Victrola, and he'd come home and he was just completely traumatized by it, and he described it as being, he said that he had heard a voice from hell, this undead, hideous parody of the human voice, and that mankind was doomed, and how could God let such things be? He was completely sincere.
give him plenty loving, treat him right. For a good man nowadays is hard to find.
I doubt if he would have had the same reaction, the next time around. But this diary entry caught him at exactly the on the cusp of the change. We don't find it extraordinary that we can hear the voices of the dead whenever we wish to. The non-mediated world has become a lost country. And I think that in some very real way, it's a country that we cannot find our way back to. The mediated world is now the world. We are that which perceives a mediated reality. I don't think it's possible to know what we've lost. We just have, I think there is a pervasive sense of loss and a pervasive excitement at what we seem to be gaining. And they see those two feelings seem to go together, or in effect to be parts of the same feeling. It's like Frederick Jameson's postmodern divine. You have it right there, that sense of loss and a sense of Christmas morning at the same time. I think that most people, myself included, are most comfortable conceptually living about 10 years back from whatever point in time we've reached. And I think we all have these moments that are vertiginous and terribly exciting and very frightening, in which we realize the contemporary, absolutely. And I think it induces terror and ecstasy, and we retreat from it because we can't stay in that state of panic, which is, I think, the real response to what's happening to us. We're more comfortable with an earlier version of who we were and what we were. It makes us feel more in control. I think the last time I had one of those CNN moments where I was slammed right up against the windshield of the president would have been flipping on the television one day and seeing that federal building in Oklahoma City lying there in its own crater, and listening to a little bit of the audio and getting the idea that something bad had happened in Middle America. And I some very, very deep within me, something seemed to say, everything is different from now on. Something very fundamental has changed here. Somehow it upped whenever something like this happens and I have one of these moments, it ups the ante on being a science fiction writer. It changes the nature of the game. Another example, maybe a better one in a way, was when it was confirmed that Michael Jackson was going to marry Elvis Presley's daughter. A good friend of mine in the States faxed me, and he said, "This makes your job more difficult." And I knew exactly what he meant, because a scenario that seemed to belong to the universe of the late Terry Southern was suddenly real. It's that truth is stranger than fiction factor keeps getting jacked up on us on a fairly regular, maybe even exponential basis. And I think that's that's something that's peculiar to our time. I don't think our grandparents had to live with that.
The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. "It's not like I'm using," Case heard someone say as he shouldered his way through the crowd around the door of the chat. It's like my body's developed this massive drug deficiency." It was a sprawl voice and a sprawl joke. The Chatsuba was a bar for professional expatriates. You could drink there for a week and never hear 2 words in Japanese. Rats was tending bar, his prosthetic arm jerking monotonously as he filled a tray of glasses with draft Kirin. He saw Case and smiled, his teeth a webwork of East European steel and brown decay.
Well, it sounds good. It sounds like something that was written in the 1940s somehow. It really is kind of weirdly Chandler-esque.
So what would you say now about that piece of writing and the man who wrote it?
I don't know. I'd buy him a drink, but I don't know if I'd loan him any money. And I think of Neuromancer as being, in a good sense, an adolescent book. It's a young man's book. It was written, very young man's book, that was written by a man who was not very young when he wrote it, but who was sufficiently immature to still get back there and get a hold of that stuff.
The bartender's smile widened. His ugliness was the stuff of legend. In an age of affordable beauty, there was something heraldic about his lack of it. The antique arm whined as he reached for another mug. It was a Russian military prosthesis, a 7-function force feedback manipulator cased in grubby pink plastic. "You are too much the artiste here, Case," Rats grunted. The sound served him as laughter. He scratched his overhang of white-shirted belly with a pink claw. "You're the artiste of the slightly funny deal." "Sure," Case said, and sipped his beer. "Someone's gotta be funny around here. Sure the fuck isn't you." The whore's giggle went up an octave. Isn't you either, sister? So you vanish, okay? Zone, he's a close personal friend of mine.
It's a world it's a world where there aren't families. It's the world of a young person going out into the wilderness of cities and sort of, in a way, creating a family. It's very, it's kind of like, it's not that it's a goth book, but it's kind of out of the same stuff that makes kids be goths.
I think of Neuromancer. It's kind of a rock and roll book. It's got everything. It's got the sex, it's got the drugs, it's got the sense of alienation. In that sense, it is truly rock and roll.
As Case was picking up his beer, one of those strange instants of silence descended, as though 100 unrelated conversations had simultaneously arrived at the same pause. Then the whore's giggle rang out, tinged with a certain hysteria. Rats grunted. An angel passed. The Chinese, bellowed a drunken Australian. Chinese bloody invented nerve splicing. Give me the mainland for a nerve job any day. Fix you right, mate. Now that, Case said to his glass, all his bitterness suddenly rising in him like bile, that is so much bullshit.
It owes a lot of its effectiveness as an experience to the fact that I didn't know what I was doing. It's a first novel, and I just had to put one foot after another. I was just terrified, actually, by it. It was very scary. I think the disappointment that I sometimes sense in younger readers who find Neuromancer and really, really like it, and then find my later work, and they're like, whoa, why can't you please do more like this? And I have to say, well, I just can't, I don't have access to that material now, and if I did, I would probably be in grave trouble. It just wouldn't be natural. It wouldn't be natural. It'd be bad news if that's where I was. In a way, I think it was personally, it was kind of bad news at the time that I was where I was then at that age. Initially, I had a lot of reluctance toward going for it, and I think that I still had that reluctance up until I met Bruce Sterling and was introduced through Bruce to some other writers who were trying to do something similar. And just having company, a little fellowship went a long way.
When Louis Shiner and I, who were part of the Turkey City group here in Austin, were first reading Gibson's work in manuscript, and we looked at it and said, look, this is breakthrough material here. This guy's really doing something different. It's like we got to put down our preconceptions and pick up on this guy from Vancouver. It's the way forward. A hole had opened up in consensus reality. I mean, we just saw daylight.
When I was writing Burning Chrome, the short story that where the word cyberspace first appeared, I knew as soon as I had the opening scene that I actually had a completely original piece.
In the early days when he used to send me short stories, I would send them around to people and I would give them copies of Omni that had his stories in them and send them to people and seek out their response, and people were just genuinely baffled.
I sat there thinking, nobody's ever done this.
I mean, they literally could not parse the guy's paragraphs. They could not make sense. It's like what is it? What is it? You know, they didn't understand concepts like cyberspace, for instance. If there was a simulated space which was inside the computer, I mean, they literally could not get their heads around that concept. I mean, what was the problem? Are they hallucinating? Is it a real space? I mean, these just the sort of, just imaginative tropes which he was inventing and deploying were just beyond people's grasp.
I met Bruce Sterling at a science fiction convention in Denver in the fall of 1981, and read Burning Chrome, the first cyberspace short story, to an audience of 4 people. Sterling, his wife, a friend of mine, and some baffled stranger. And it was like the most fun I think I ever had reading anything, because Bruce completely got it.
We were aware that computers were a bigger social revolution in the making than space flight was ever going to be, or that robots ever had been.
No one seemed to have noticed that there was a territory there.
Yeah, when we were first hanging out with computer geeks, yeah, it was not something you spoke about in public. I mean, really, if you went to a party and started talking about your Apple II, people would walk off diagonally. We turned out to be great glamorizers. We were able to make computers glamorous. And of course, we weren't the only ones. I mean, once people caught on that was possible, you had Madison Avenue move into the job. AT&T hires people to tell people that now. It's, it's become a very mainstream message.
I had a hunch that it was going to change things in the way that the advent of the ubiquity of the automobile changed things. It changed how we dressed, how we eat. These things affect everything.
I mean, this was a supermodel among technologies. It was just a matter of spraying on this hairspray and slapping on some lip gloss, and this thing was going to walk. They were going to be cute, they were going to be miniature, they would be designed, they would be adorable. That the boundaries of the human body would be crossed.
What made you choose science fiction rather than some other form of fiction?
Well, it was my native literary culture, and it was what I had grown up on. I saw it as a viable but essentially derelict form of popular art, and I thought that was a remarkable thing. I probably started looking at what was being done then in science fiction in around 1976 or 77. I saw an opening, I thought, I can fill the gap here. Maybe I can do something. Maybe I can do something with this. That was the conscious part of it. The unconscious part of it, I don't know. I know that it seemed a weird and pathetic thing to try to do.
Were you still a student when you first got published?
Yeah, I figured out that I could make a living or augment my living by being a student, which was possible in Canada at that time. If you could maintain a high enough grade point average, they were very generous. They'd give you loans and then forgive them. And, in fact, I wasn't even really studying. I was just maintaining a grade point average of reading books.
You came to Canada to dodge the draft, didn't you?
Well, I had a peculiar experience with that. I had gone in and basically told them the truth. I told them that my one ambition in life was to take every mind-altering substance that existed on the face of the planet, and I just went in and babbled about wanting to be like William Burroughs. That seemed to do the trick. That and the fact that I promptly, within a week or two, exited the country for several years. You know, I was very, very lucky in the timing of that, because if I had turned up at an induction center 2 years later with the same line, they would have said, "Don't worry, son, we'll make a man of you." And they wouldn't even have let me back out the building. And I went home and bought a bus ticket to Toronto. But I don't like to take too much credit for that having been a political act in the sense that political acts are sometimes understood. It had much more. It had much more to do with my wanting to be with hippie girls and have lots of hashish than it did with my sympathy for the plight of the North Vietnamese people under U.S. imperialism. Much more to do with hippie girls than hashish. Consequently, when I got to Toronto, actually, to my, I think, chagrin somewhat, I found that I really, really couldn't handle hanging out with the American draft dodgers. There was too much clinical depression. There was too much suicide. There was too much hardcore substance abuse. They were a traumatized lot, those boys. And I just felt like I felt frivolous. Toronto's Summer of Love was up there with San Francisco's, I would imagine. It was really quite a party. Sort of an alternative mode of perception. Most of the people, I suppose really everyone that I counted as a close friend, seemed to harbor the unspoken assumption that everything that had gone before us was ending. It was really a very millennial time, far more millennial than this last year of the century.
What did you think was ending?
The straight world. I think that's what I would have told you at the time. But the straight world didn't end. The straight world and the other world bled into one another and produced the world that we live in today. Drugs were absolutely central to that experience, but they weren't essential. They weren't actually essential to it. I only know that in retrospect. At the time, I'm sure I would have said that they were. Ingesting the right chemical was absolutely essential to the experience, but in retrospect, no. It was simply a matter of being there and being somewhat open to possibilities. What you couldn't have told me at that stage in my life, what I couldn't have told me at that stage in my life that I've subsequently come to accept, is that all any drug amounts to is tweaking the incoming data. And you have to be really incredibly self-centered or pathetic to be satisfied with simply tweaking the incoming data. Enough of the right drug and anything is groovy. Enough of the right drug and it's okay to be having open heart surgery. Well, who wants that? My experience has been that beyond a certain point, there's only pathology. You're not dealing with a personality anymore. You're dealing with a kind of hardwired pathology. You're dealing with a chemical entity, a neurochemical entity. It doesn't really have much to do with who the person it's manifesting in was. Recreational drugs are essentially a wank, and a wank is okay, but you really should know that it's just a wank. And I think that's what we didn't know, to use the generational we, and what some of us still don't know. I was kept from the opiates by having read Burroughs. I knew from even before I'd ever tried any mind-altering substances that heroin was really addictive, and that you thought it wasn't when you began to take it, but then you discovered that it was. You know, the opiates aside, I tried whatever was going. You know, I sort of prided myself on it. In fact, I was sort of a very regular cannabis user for a number of years, in spite of the fact that I always had a terrible time with it. And, you know, I've long since come to realize that I suffer from cannabis dysphoria, like the lowest possible dose of cannabinol makes me incredibly uncomfortable and unhappy. I think it's just easier to die doing that stuff than people are comfortable admitting. You know, at least people who like to do that stuff. A certain number of people do their accustomed dose of cocaine, or sometimes even their very first dose of cocaine, and simply drop dead. You know, a certain percentage of people do. It's kind of like, you know, the street drug thing is when did you ever hear a drug dealer? When did you ever go to a drug dealer and the drug dealer says, you know, you should come back tomorrow, this is not very pure. Yeah, it's not too good tonight, come next week. It doesn't happen.
Where are we?
This is Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The closest thing to a city near where my parents were living in a beach house when I was born in 1948. This was a farm that my parents had rented, I believe, while my father's construction company put in a lot of the civilian sort of workaday plumbing around the Oak Ridge Atomic Project. My father was working there during the production of the bombs, I believe. Army Jeep of some kind. This is in Virginia Beach or nearby, which is where I lived just prior to my father's death in 56. Upon his death, within a matter of days, my mother had packed everything up and taken me back to Withville, which was the town both my parents came from in southwest Virginia. She stayed there for the rest of her life. My mother's death when I was 19 coincided with the beginning of what we think of as the 60s. I was in a boarding school in Tucson, Arizona, and we would see the people coming and going from San Francisco. You know, you couldn't miss them, really. There had never been people in America who looked like that, and they looked like they were having a pretty good time. So, you know, I knew already that something was going on. No one had given it a name yet. What was going on inside me and what was going on in the world outside were very, very confused for me. I had no way of sorting those things out. You know, it just seemed like the inside of my head was going off and the outside was going off as well. I know I became very, very isolated for a long time. I mean, I really do think, I mean, maybe it's just a middle-aged thing, but I'm inclined to think that I was crazy at some level for a long time. But it's only become apparent to me relatively late in life. And And it's only become apparent because I no longer feel that I am crazy.
What makes you anxious these days?
I think the thing that makes me most anxious at this point in my life is the thought that I might not be able to become as honest with myself as I would like to become. Because I think that more real is always better, but it's not necessarily given to us as individuals to always be more real. I'm not a didactic writer, I hope. There's nothing I want less to be than someone couching a conscious message in prose fiction. But I think one of the things that I see when I look back at my earlier work is a struggle to recognize and accept that the heart is the master and the head is the servant, and that is always the case, except when it isn't the case, we're in deep, deep trouble. And we're often in deep, deep trouble. So that's the way it starts to look to me now when I look back at it. But I wouldn't have been able to articulate that 20 years ago.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is no cause for alarm.
Did you read William Burroughs' last piece?
Yeah, I thought that was absolutely extraordinary. It was so wonderful that I almost didn't believe it. It was so much what I would have wanted his last words to be. Burroughs' death was something that I had anticipated for many, many years as being, I didn't know what would happen to me. It's, in some way that I can't explain, he was just terribly, 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 terribly important to me. But when he went, it was okay. I mean, I was okay. It was okay. I just felt okay. That's like, it's okay. He's gone. I didn't have a sense of loss, and I don't think I didn't have to grieve. It was quite extraordinary, but it was a real milestone for me. I had a sense that he had a couple of really deep, really powerful resolutions that came to him very late. One piece of his I read, he spoke of, no, it might have been an interview, he spoke of going into a sweat lodge ceremony, or possibly a series of them, and being relieved, finally, of that which he had always referred to as the ugly spirit. And before he died, he spoke quite movingly and lovingly of his wife, whom he killed in a blackout in Mexico City. And he seemed to have come to terms with that. And it just seemed that at the end of his life, he was okay.
What about the rest of us? What's going to save the rest of us?
Acceptance of the impermanence of being, and acceptance of the imperfect nature of being, or possibly the perfect nature of being, depending on how one looks at it. Acceptance that this is not a rehearsal for the that this is it. this is the deal. This is your life. Basically, I don't know. I find I'm, all the fridge magnets of the new age have a certain kernel of truth in them, I think.
What about religion?
I remember consciously rejecting it at some point when I was 12 or 13 or 14 years old, insofar as I decided that was not whatever might be going on. It wasn't going on for me in the church. That wasn't where it was happening, and that's kind of continued as a constant for me. That I don't feel like it's happening in the church, although I think that it can, whatever it is, it can happen there. Perhaps in spite of all odds, it can happen there. I think of religions as franchise operations, sort of like chicken franchises, but that doesn't mean there's no chicken, right? It's difficult to articulate. Actually, by the time you get it reduced to something, that you can talk about, you don't really have anything. I mean, language is such an extraordinary thing, but at the same time, it's just like big monkeys standing up and making noises that sound like God. Like what does that convey?
What's happiness to you?
I think happiness is being in the moment, and not living in anticipation and not living in recollection, but being in the moment, which is, sounds very simple, but the actual practice of it can become incredibly complicated, and I don't think anyone really achieves it with any constancy. When I first started trying to write, I remember going to a professor of mine and saying, "How do people do this? How do people ever do this? I don't understand how do fiction writers do this?" And he looked at me a while, and then he said, "They have rich inner lives, I think." It was extremely painful. It was extremely strange and painful, and in retrospect, I don't really understand why I persisted. I took it very seriously, and I went away and started thinking about what sort of rich inner life one would have to have. I felt that I had no native talent for it. It came so hard to me, and yet I desperately wanted to be a writer and to be able to be a writer of fiction.
But why did you want to be a writer?
I don't know. I really don't know. It was just, it was there. I had been a reader all my life, and if you could make a living being a reader, like being a really good reader, I'd be like, really comfortably off from being a reader, and I wouldn't have had to become a writer. Something like that. Like many people who've been lifetime readers, I had aspired to be a writer, but I don't know why. what I found I had to do to start to write fiction was to rediscover the mechanism of daydreaming as play that I had had as a child. And there aren't too many activities that resemble writing fiction. I think a child daydreams, or someone's masturbation fantasies might be the closest, you know, in terms of using actual parts of the brain. Those are similar models. I think the process of fantasies of anxiety probably a similar thing. Imagining yourself having a very hard time and getting into great detail in order to make it more convincing and increase your anxiety. That probably takes up some similar territory in the brain. I initially started by trying to write little units of fiction. And I remember, you know, laboring for months on end on an opening sentence and being very frustrated with it, and finally getting this very long and over-elaborated sentence which went nowhere. It was something like seated each afternoon in the darkened screening room, Halliday came to recognize the targeted numerals of the Academy leader as sigils preceding the dream state of film. And I actually worked on that so long that I could still remember it 20-some years later. And it went nowhere at all. I mean, that was simply it. It was like one of those Ballardian paragraph stories. And it was very consciously Ballardian. It's like a little pastiche of J.G. Ballard. But it went nowhere. And I remember wondering about that, like, how did one introduce movement? And I just kept going back to that activity and trying different things until finally it started to move a little bit. What I did with movement, because I became so frustrated with my inability to physically move the characters through the imaginary narrative space, that I actually developed an early form in my fiction, a sort of early form of imaginary VR technology that served that sort of covered my ass in terms of not being able to move the characters, because they could simply change channels. And it was some sort of recorded memory technology. And all they had to do was switch tapes, and they'd be in a different place. And I was spared the embarrassment of demonstrating that I didn't know how to get them up and down stairs, in and out of vehicles at that point. So in a way, that sort of invention began out of necessity and inexperience. But it opened up interesting territory. Well, I'd gotten to a point in my early fiction, and you know, we're really talking like two or three attempted short stories, and I'd gotten to a point where I needed a buzzword. I needed to replace the rocket ship and the holodeck with something else that would be a signifier of technological change, and that would provide me with a narrative engine and a territory in which the narrative could take place. And I don't think I realized that quite what a tall order that was. And in the way people sometimes do, I solved the problem in a very offhand way. All I really knew about the word cyberspace when I coined it was that it seemed like an effective buzzword. It was evocative and essentially meaningless. It was very suggestive of something, but it had like no real semantic meaning, even for me, as I saw it emerge on the page.
But it's not just the word, it's the idea of a virtual reality inside a computer network. Where did that come from?
My input for doing that was my experience of the very first Sony Walkman as a really intimate interface device that I could carry around. My observation of the body language of kids playing those early plywood-sided arcade games. Like I saw the kids playing those games and I knew that they wanted to reach right through the screen and get with what they were playing with there. And I thought, well, if there's a space behind the screen and everybody's got these things at some level, maybe only metaphorically, those spaces are all the same space. And as soon as I thought that, I had it. It's interesting that it's become common parlance. I had no idea that would happen. It's a strange thing for me. I mean, I see it in every newspaper that I open. It's become part of the language, which is very nice. But I simply marvel that that's happened, because I had no idea that no one else would do it. It's a very singular and peculiar thing. Cyberspace one day might be the last usage of the prefix cyber, because I think cyber is going to go the way of electro. We don't use the prefix electro in pop cultural parlance much anymore. Electricity being taken for granted that most things are electrical. And I think that at this point it could be taken for granted that most things are computerized.
William Gibson's limousine, good morning.
Jack Womack here.
Hello, Jack. Tell me, would you describe William Gibson as a visionary?
I would definitely call him a visionary. I mean, it's like, I quite honestly feel that if he had not written Neuromancer when he did about the world as it is, and much more about the world which is to come, would not have taken place in the exact way it has. We would have computers, we would have the internet, we would have cyberspace as it presently exists, but I think if so many people who weren't in computers at that point, they're working away on their programs, writing away on their designs, thinking up what might be done with this new media. If they hadn't read Neuromancer and thought, boy, what a cool idea this is, let's see if we can't make it happen, I'm not sure that precisely things would be happening in the same way.
So it was less about predicting and more about affecting the shape of things to come.
He and I have talked about that, and he told me, he said, when I first thought of cyberspace, I thought of it as a metaphor, and then Neuromancer came out, and everyone said, oh, dude, this is very cool, and took it seriously. It was, something beyond just the fashion to wear for that season. They just took it as something very, very real. Initially, it was just like, a literary conceit.
I've always been marketed as your hot ticket to the future. And because I've been so uncomfortable with that, I've had to, I devote a lot of time to attempting to debunk my sort of inherited marketing category, because I don't think that's what I do. I think we live in an incomprehensible present, and that what I'm actually trying to do is illuminate the moment and make the moment accessible. I'm not even really trying to explain the moment. I'm just trying to make it accessible.
Laney looked at the tweaked Hillman on his screen. You haven't told me what I'm looking for. Anything that might be of interest to SlitScan, which is to say, Laney, anything that might be of interest to SlitScan's audience.
SlitScan, the fictional culture of SlitScan is my extrapolation from the existence of People magazine and National Enquirer and Hello, that sort of thing. It's just pushed, all the knobs have been cranked over in my version, and the brakes are off, and that's the result.
Anything that might be of interest to SlitScan, which is to say, Laney, anything that might be of interest to SlitScan's audience, which is best visualized as a vicious, lazy, profoundly ignorant, perpetually hungry organism craving the warm gut flesh of the anointed. Personally, I like to imagine something the size of a baby hippo, the color of a week-old boiled potato, that lives by itself, in the dark, in a double wide on the outskirts of Topeka. It's covered with eyes, and it sweats constantly. The sweat runs into those eyes and makes them sting. It has no mouth, Laney, no genitals, and can only express its mute extremes of murderous rage and infantile desire by changing the channels on a universal remote, or by voting in presidential elections.
This is now, that's, that's like the end of the 90s. But to me, it's not so much about defining the SlitScan audience, which is the audience for this highly vicious form of tabloid TV journalism, but of defining the producer's contempt for her audience.
What do you find yourself focusing on these days?
I think I find myself thinking more in historical terms, sort of been looking at, where this whole crazy thing came from, all these cities. I think I'm unhappiest in cities. And they don't impress me generally at all. They really fascinate me. I think of cities as a machine. Each one is a sort of mechanism. Sometimes walking through Manhattan, I've been struck with just some very simple kind of wonder and amazement at the fact that this thing works. That, that it's possible to have something as singular and crazy as Manhattan Island. And by and large, it works. People are walking around, doing what they're doing. You've been to Detroit?
No, but I've seen pictures.
The urban core, you know, the skyscraper core of Detroit is empty. It's a ruin. It's a complete ghost town. Someone proposed several years ago that the place simply be allowed to fall apart, and that it would be the American Acropolis. And of course, the good burghers of Detroit flipped out and said, "You can't do that. The downtown is coming back. You gotta have faith. We have this beautiful city." But they can't get anybody to live there. There's nobody after dark but a few homeless people and some deer that have wandered in from the country. It's like the city's turning back into countryside there. I find this a pretty haunted neighborhood. All these big cinemas turned into wholesale jewelry stores. This was all very grand in this sort of 1911, 1920s. There's the Union Trust Company there, which is now Hill Center Mart. It was built with this optimism that expected it to be used for the purpose it was intended for, obviously for hundreds of years. And the building is still hanging together perfectly well. It's just that Union Trust has long moved on and migrated to cyberspace, probably. I don't have a very conscious creative process at all. Those books don't happen because I think about them. They happen. I'm more and more conscious lately that they happen. Books happen because I write them, and the genuinely creative parts emerge from the actual process of putting one word after another. Then the bits that I enjoy, which are the bits that surprise me and that I didn't expect, they come out of the actual process of writing. They don't come out of a process of cogitating and consciously trying to be visionary or imagining what the future would be like. They just emerge from this very analog process of one word after another. I feel that if I'm doing my job, if I'm doing the job that I'm supposed to do, I will not be in control of the narrative. If I'm really achieving something with the characterization, the characters become impossible to control. And they start driving the action and losing the plot. I have to make a deal with myself that I'll turn up and make a real effort to see if there's any incoming mail. But there are times when the process just remains closed to me, and it won't happen. And the conscious part of me, the part of me that's talking to you now, is not really that which writes those books. I mean, the books are written by me. The books are written by the guy who's talking to you now in collaboration with his unconscious. And I don't have reliable access to my unconscious all the time. I have to wait for it to turn up sometimes.
At that point had been in stasis, employed by the management of Low Res, the pop group, to facilitate singer Rez's marriage to the Japanese virtual star Rei Tawai.
Lainey had settled into a life in Tokyo that centered around visits to a private, artificially constructed island in Tokyo Bay. an expensive nub of engineered landfill upon which Rez and Ray To'ai intended to bring forth some sort of new reality.
That Laney had never been able to quite grasp the nature of this reality hadn't surprised him. Rez was a law unto himself, very possibly the last of the pre-post-human megastars.
It's a very strange thing we do when we write novels, because this is an act that began somewhere with someone making a mark on a piece of wood or a rock, and it's grown into millions of marks on sheets of paper that are bound together, that in a trained reader produce incredibly complicated, complex reactions.
And Laney fell in love with her, although he understood that she'd been designed for him and the world to fall in love with. As the amplified reflection
of desire, she was a team effort. To the extent that her designers had done their jobs properly, she was a waking dream, a love object sprung from an approximation of the global mass unconscious.
If there's been any visualization of a text of mine, a film or comic book or even an illustration, I'm always struck by the innocence with which some readers will say, but that isn't what it looks like. That's not what she looks like. And it always makes me smile, because I realize when they say that they haven't actually realized that they are the creator of what it looks like as much as I am.
This is human, I think.
This is human, I think, she said. When pressed, this is the result of what you are, biochemically, being stressed in a particular way.
Being stressed in a particular way. This is wonderful. This is closed to me.
Writing is inherently a collaborative act, because the recipient of the writing will create an inner world according to whatever they're bringing to the text. Anna has set up her cam. Anna is a singer and performance artist. Oh yeah, I know her.
Is that how you thought it would turn out?
No, not at all. I mean, I just didn't imagine that art girls in the Midwest would be flashing their tits in cyberspace, although I'm glad they are. I was in New York and we were down at the Chelsea Antique Market looking at Civil War era pornography. Hardcore, like Matthew Brady hardcore. And I never knew that this stuff existed. And it ranges, it's everything from cheesecake, some of which is totally charming, cheesecake to just the rawest, full-on hardcore, daguerreotypes. The technology was new. The technology was there for the first time to reproduce pornographic photographic images. And because there were these Union armies, there were tens, hundreds of thousands of lonely, wanking soldiers marching across the United States. So, the American porno industry was born there, I suppose. Like it's modern, the Larry Flint world was sort of born on the battlefield at Gettysburg. And there's a market for this stuff. There's a very serious collector's market. And I have a friend named Richard, who's by day a dealer in rare books, and by night a dealer in Civil War porno. My friend Richard reminded me once again that new media is always driven by pornography. almost always, any new media that gets out into the world. For instance, it wasn't true of television, but television was a broadcast medium. As soon as television became home video, a lot of developments in it of like what you could do with it were driven by the desire to create pornography. He said that as far as he knew, the most sophisticated marketing and billing on the internet was net porn. Those are the guys who have been doing e-commerce all along. A couple of years ago, Bruce Sterling came up with a scenario in which it was discovered that there was no viable way to make money, really make serious money on the web. And the web would become a sort of ghost town. And it would be re-inherited by the sort of crazy people who were there in the first place. The corporations would all go home and it would all be a sort of giant ghost site. Well, my understanding, such as it is that the internet exists today because DARPA, a federally funded think tank, was asked by the Pentagon to create a communication system that would survive a major nuclear war, global nuclear war. And DARPA came up with the idea of connecting the mainframe computers, existing mainframe computers in universities in the Western world, in a switching system that would allow the communication to be carried around problem areas, say a Chicago that no longer existed. And if this switching was sufficiently fast, they'd be able to communicate right through the event of the nuclear war, regardless of which cities were being vaporized. So these university mainframes were connected, and what we know today as the internet grew out of that as a completely unplanned side effect. And I rather believe that if that side effect could have been foreseen, the people who ordered those mainframes connected would have had second thoughts, because it will eventually bring about their extinction. To a large extent, it will bring about the extinction of the nation state as we know it. And that is an unplanned impact of technology. We're using technology to extend the human nervous system. We're sort of, the internet is a kind of global prosthetic extension of human consciousness. It wasn't consciously intended as one, but it amounts to one. The internet, if one could see its totality, I think would be a very profound expression of what it is to be human today. But I think it will be, it's almost meaningless. It's almost meaningless to say even now, because it's become the place where we do everything. It's become the place where we look for everything. We're doing something new here. It resembles some things we've done before, but it's different. I think it's probably as big a deal as the creation of cities.
number of your characters are searching for meaning in cyberspace. Lainey and Idoru, looking for patterns in the flow of data. Gentry in Mona Lisa Overdrive, looking for the overall shape of cyberspace.
I mean, I think for me that's the nature of experience, is sensing through all this stuff that we're moving through some huge structure that's too big to get a handle on. And the question is then how important is it? Why are we drawn back to that? Why do we do that? You know, why do we, in evolutionary terms, why do we do that stuff? We seem to do it as a species. What is it in service of? We've been trying to do that forever. But why, I wonder why we do it. I mean, here we are, bipedal mammals with opposable thumbs and overgrown frontal lobes, creating this wacky collection of artifacts that we're moving through now and sitting in and recording on. Why do we do that? How did it come to be? What is the shape of that if we could see it from without, which we can't because we are it. It's just basic curiosity. What's going on here? Why am I here? What's it all mean, if anything? And I think that's, in my sort of mid-cult way, I wrestle with that stuff in my fiction.
When we were only several 100,000 years old, we built stone circles, water clocks. Later, someone forged an iron spring, set clockwork running, imagined grid lines on a globe. Cathedrals are like machines defining the soul. The bells of clock towers stitch the sleeper's dreams together. You see? So we've always been on our way to this new place. That is no place really, but is real. It's our nature to represent. We're the animal that represents. The sole and only maker of maps. And if our weakness has been to confuse the bright and bloody colors of our calendars with the true weather of days, and the parchment territory of our maps with the land spread out before us, never mind. We've always been on our way to this new place. That is no place really, but is real.